Section 32 of Tribal Custom in Anglo-Saxon Law. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kristen Hand. Tribal Custom in Anglo-Saxon Law by Frederic Seebohm. Chapter 14, The Laws of the Kentish Kings, Part 1. 1. Distinction from Anglo-Saxon laws, A.D. 596 to 696. The laws of the Kentish kings, if they had been on all fours with the other Anglo-Saxon laws, would have taken back the general evidence for Anglo-Saxon custom another 100 years earlier than the laws of Ine, and nearer the time of the conquest of Britain. As it is, however, they have to be treated as in part exceptional. It is very probable that for a long period the proximity of Kent to the continent had resulted in the approximation of its social and economic conditions to those of the opposite shore of the Channel. The southeast corner of Britain was described by Caesar as having been colonized by Belgae and as having been for some time under Belgic rule. The Belgic tribes were the furthest advance of Celtic tribes and, according to Caesar, had fostered agriculture, while his informants spoke of the interior of Britain as pastoral. Under Roman rule, the prominence of agriculture was continued. Ammianus Marcellinus describes large exports of British corn to supply Roman legions on the Rhine. He speaks of the British tributary in a way which suggests that this part of Britain under Roman rule had become subject to economic arrangements similar to those of the Belgic provinces of Gaul. The introduction, by invitation, of the Jutes into Kent and their settlement, in the first instance at all events, under a friendly agreement of payment of annae, may have given an exceptional character to the results of ultimate conquest. The permanent prominence of agriculture is perhaps shown by the fiscal assessment in salungs and yokes instead of hides and virgats. The exceptional conditions of the Kentish district were continued by its being the earliest to come into close contact with the court of the Merovingian Franks and with ecclesiastical influences from Rome. The mission of St. Augustine resulted in the codification of Kentish custom into written law a century earlier than the date of the earliest laws of Wessex. The peculiar character of Kentish custom may have been further maintained by the partial isolation of Kent. The kingdom of the Kentish kings, though lessened in Ethelbert's time by the encroachment of Wessex, had maintained its independence of both the Northumbrian and Mercian supremacy, or Bretwaldership. Apart from any original difference in custom between Jutish and other tribes, this isolation naturally produced divergence in some respects from the customs of the rest of Anglo-Saxon England, and may perhaps partly explain why the laws of the Kentish kings came to be included in only one of the early collections of Anglo-Saxon laws. Further, when we approach the subject of Kentish weregelds, we do so with the direct warning, already alluded to, of the writer of the so-called Laws of Henry I, that we shall find them differing greatly from those of Wessex. This we have said according to our law and custom, but the difference of weregeld is great in Kent, villanorum et baronum. Moreover, in after times, Kentish custom differed from that of other parts of England in the matter of succession. The custom of gavelkind prevailed in Kent, and among the statutes after the Norman conquest, there is an undated statement setting forth peculiar customs of Kent in matters where they differed from those of the rest of the kingdom. Some of these differences may have been of later origin, but a comparison of the laws themselves with other Anglo-Saxon laws is conclusive upon the point that important differences always existed, and what is more, were recognized as existing. Although the Kentish laws are not included with other Anglo-Saxon laws in any manuscript but that of Rochester, yet they were known to King Alfred. He mentioned them in the proem to his laws, as well as the Mercian laws, as among those which he had before him in framing his own. Moreover, we have seen that at the time of the Danish invasion, certain differences between the Kentish and other laws were known and noted correctly in the fragment of Girth and of Mund. Finally, in its system of monetary reckoning, the Kentish kingdom seems to have been peculiar from the first. And as our knowledge of the Kentish weregelds is essential to an understanding of the division of classes, a good deal must depend upon a previous understanding of the currency in which the amounts of the weregelds were described. Before proceeding further, it is necessary, therefore, to devote a section to a careful consideration of the subject. The experience already gained will not be thrown away if it should help us to understand the meaning of the scaats and skillings of the Kentish laws. 2. The scaats and skillings of the Kentish laws. All the payments mentioned in the Kentish laws are stated in scaats and skillings, naturally by far the larger number of them in the latter. What were these scaats and skillings? First, what were the scaats? We have already seen that before the time of Offa, the silver coinage current in England consisted mainly of the silver tremises of Merovingian standard, i.e. 20 to the Roman ounce, or 28.8 wheat grains. These are known to numismatists as silver pence of the scaat series. That these silver coins were known by the name of scaats, we seem to have the direct and independent evidence of the following fragment on Mercian law, already quoted but sufficiently important to be repeated here. Corles Vergeld is on Mycia large cc skill. Pegnes Vergeld is 6 swa Michael, Payet bio 12 hund skill. Pon bio signes Eifeld Vergeld 6 Pegna ver bei Myrina Laga Payet s XXX Pusend Skeata and Payet bio Elias CXX Punda. The Corles Vergeld is in the law of the Mercians 200 skillings. The Thanes Vergeld is 6 times as much, i.e., 1,200 skillings. Then is the King's simple Vergeld 6 Thanes Vergeld by Mercian law, i.e., 30,000 scaats, and that is in all 120 pounds. Now, as previously observed, the sum of 30,000 scaats must evidently be taken as a round sum. The statement that the King's simple Vergeld was 120 pounds, or 6 times the Thanes Vergeld of 1,200 Mercian skillings, seems to make this clear, for 7,200 Mercian skillings of 4 scaats, 28,800 scaats, would amount exactly to 120 pounds. That the scaats of this fragment of Mercian law were the same silver coins as the scaats of the Kentish laws is further confirmed by numismatic evidence. The evidence of the coins themselves and of the names of the moneyers impressed on them seems to make it probable that to a large extent till the time of Egbert, who was intimate with Charlemagne, and perhaps even till the time of his grandson Ethelbald, in the words of Mr. Carey, Kent still provided all the currency of the South. It would seem, therefore, that practically during the whole period of the issue of the silver pence of the scaat series, the greater part of them were minted by Kentish moneyers. And thus numismatic evidence applies not only to the coinage of Wessex, but also to that of Mercia. We can hardly be wrong, then, in thinking that this valuable fragment of Mercian law in using the word scaat referred back to an ancient custom before the scaat had been superseded by the penny, and therefore must be good evidence that the silver coins called scaats in Mercia were similar to those called scaats in Kent. In other words, the Kentish scaat, notwithstanding the slight difference in spelling, was almost certainly the silver scaat of 28.8 wheat grains, i.e., 20 to the Roman ounce. It is quite true that the word scaat was used in the laws in 2 senses, sometimes for money or property, and sometimes for the coin. But so also was the scaat of the Kentish laws, and it may not always be easy to ascertain with certainty which meaning is the right one. But the Kentish and Mercian laws were not alone in using the word for the silver coin. The phrase scaats and skillings was elsewhere used to denote the typical smaller and larger monetary unit, or perhaps we ought to say the silver and the gold unit. In the 10th century translation of the New Testament, the word denarius is translated by peaning. For long before this, the penny of 32 wheat grains had superseded the old coinage of the scaat series. but in the translation of Ulfilas, the word scat is used for the silver denarius. At the same time, it is important to observe that the word skilling was the Gothic word applied to the gold solidus in legal documents of the 6th century during Gothic rule in Italy. According to the bilingual records in the archives of the Gothic Church of St. Anastasia at Ravenna, payments were made in so many skilligans. So that probably silver scats and certainly gold skillings were familiar to the Goths of Italy. Again, scaats and skillings were evidently the two monetary units familiar to the mind of Caedmon or whoever was the author of the metrical translation of Genesis. In chapter 14, verse 23, Abraham is made to swear that he would take neither scaat ne skilling from the kingdom of Sodom. Moreover, in the fragment on oaths in the Anglo-Saxon laws, Thorpe, page 76, the same phrase is used. On lefendis gods nemen, ne orif ik ne scat ne skilling, ne paying ne paynage veard. S11. In the name of the living God, I owe not to n scaat or skilling, not penny or penny's worth. Surely in both phrases, the phrase scaat ne skilling refers to coins or units of account of two denominations in current use, as in the Kentish laws. It is even possible, perhaps, to find an illustration of the reckoning in scaats and skillings in the well-known passage in the Skald's Tale already quoted. Se me beag forgif, on them 600 vees, smeet golds, gescried scaata skilling rhyme. He me a bracelet gave, on which 600 was of beaten gold, scored of scaats in skillings reckoned. If these words may be properly translated literally, of scaats in skillings reckoned, and are taken to mean 600 scaats in skillings reckoned, the phrase accords very closely with the method of reckoning in the Salic laws, so many hundred denarii, i.e., so many solidi. Returning to the scaats and skillings of the laws of Ethelbert, the most obvious suggestion would be that the currency in Kent was similar to that on the other side of the Channel under the Merovingian princes. The two courts were so closely connected by Ethelbert's marriage, and probably by trade intercourse, that the most likely guess, at first sight, would be that the Kentish scaats were silver tremises, and the Kentish skillings gold solidi, like those of the Lex Salica. We have seen that the Merovingian currency was mainly in gold tremises, and as many of the 100 gold tremises contained in the celebrated Crondale find are believed by numismatists to have been coined in Kent by English moneyers, the currency of gold tremises in England is directly confirmed, though the silver currency seems very soon to have superseded it. At the date of Ethelbert's laws, A.D. 596, the Merovingian currency was still mainly gold, i.e. gold tremises, 3 of which went to the gold solidus of the Salic laws. And if the skilling of Ethelbert, like the solidus of the Franks, had been a solidus of 40 denarii, we might have concluded at once that Ethelbert's skilling, like the Merovingian solidus, was a solidus of 3 gold tremises, or 40 silver scaats. But the facts apparently will not allow us to come to this conclusion. Schmid has shown, I think conclusively, by inference from certain passages in Ethelbert's laws, that the Kentish skilling was of 20 scaats instead of 40. We therefore must deal with the Kentish skilling on its own evidence. Now, 20 scaats of 28.8 wheat grains, as we have seen, made the Roman ounce of 576 wheat grains. The Kentish skilling was therefore the equivalent of an ounce of silver. And so in the Kentish laws, so far as reckoning in silver was concerned, the same method was adopted as that of the Welsh, who reckoned in scores or unisae of silver, and that which became the common Frankish and Norman reckoning of 20 pence to the ounce and 12 ounces to the pound. Indeed, when we consider that under common Scandinavian custom, gold and silver were weighed and reckoned in marks, oars, and oartugs, it would seem natural that the Kentish immigrants from the north should have been already familiar with a reckoning in oars or ounces of silver. But why did they call the ounce of silver a skilling? We might as well perhaps ask why the Wessex skilling was 5 pence and the Mercian skilling 4 pence. But the word skilling had, as we have seen, been used by the Goths in Italy for the gold solidus, and on the continent the gold solidus in the 6th and 7th centuries, and indeed till the time of Charlemagne, was so far the recognized symbol of value that the Vergelds of the northern tribes, whether they remained in the north or emigrated southwards, were invariably stated in their laws in gold solidi. The most natural inference would therefore seem to be that the Kentish skilling, like that of the Salic law, must have been a gold solidus equated, however, in account with 20 silver pence or scaeads. Now, at the ratio of 1 to 10, the ore or ounce of 20 silver scaeads would equal a gold solidus of 2 gold tremises instead of 3. And when it is considered that the main Merovingian currency on the other side of the channel was of gold tremises, it seems natural that the ounce of silver should be equated with an even number of gold tremises. Nor would there be anything unprecedented or unusual in a gold solidus of 2 tremises instead of 3. For we have seen that when Charlemagne conquered the Frisians and the Saxons, he found that the solidi in which they had traditionally paid their Velgelds were not always, like the imperial and the Salic solidi, of 3 gold tremises, but that each district had its own peculiar solidus. The solidus of the southern division of Frisia was of 2.5 gold tremises. The solidus of the middle district was the ordinary gold solidus of 3 tremises. The traditional solidus of the district presumably nearest to the Jutes, i.e. on both the Frisian and Saxon side of the Weser, was the solidus of 2 tremises. The Saxon solidus of 2 tremises, representing the 1-year-old bullock, was that in which, according to the Lex Saxonum, the Saxon Vergelds had been traditionally paid. We have no distinct mention of a Jutish solidus, but as the Jutes probably came from a district not far from that of the North Frisians and Saxons, there would be nothing abnormal or surprising in their reckoning in the same solidus as their neighbors, viz., in the gold solidus of 2 tremises, and in the Kentish immigrants continuing the same practice. But this as yet is only conjecture. So far, then, as the facts of the prevalent coinage and currency are concerned, all that can be said is that the hypothesis that the Kentish skilling was that of 2 gold tremises has a good deal of probability in its favor. But there is other and more direct evidence of the truth of the hypothesis. In the first place, as already stated, in the preface to King Alfred's laws, he expressly mentions his knowledge of the laws, not only of Ine and of Offa, but also of Ethelbert, the inference being that in his own laws he retained inter alia some of the enactments of Ethelbert which were in his own view worth retaining. Now King Alfred fixed the king's mundberd at 5 pounds of silver, i.e. 240 Wessex skillings, while he must have known that in the Kentish law the king's mundberg was 50 Kentish skillings. The difference in skillings must have struck him, but he probably knew perfectly well what the Kentish skillings were, for when we compare these 2 mundberds, we find that at a ratio between gold and silver of 1 to 12, which, as we have seen, was the Frankish ratio of Charlemagne's successors, 50 Kentish skillings of 2 gold tremises did equal exactly 5 pounds. 50 Kentish skillings, or 100 Merovingian gold tremises, at 1 to 20 were equal to 1,200 silver tremises, or scaeads of the same weight, i.e. 5 pounds of 240 scaeads, or in other words, 100 gold tremises, nova moneta, were equal at the same ratio to 5 pounds of 240 of King Alfred's pence of 32 wheat grains. The equation was exact. And further, we have seen that in the time of Knut, the Kentish king's mundberd was well known and declared to be 5 pounds according to Kentish law, although in that law it was stated to be 50 skillings. The passage has already been quoted from the MSG of Knut's Church Law, S3, in which, after stating that the girth Bryce of the chief minister in cases entitled to bot is according to the king's mund, that is, 5 pounds by English law. The additional information is inserted. On Kent land et pom mund Bryce 5 pund pom king. In Kent land for the Mundbreis, £5 to the king. Further, in the same MSG of Newt's Secular Law S63 is the following. Give hwa ham son ge vers ge bet p mid 5 punden pam sink on engla lag 7 on cent et ham son 5 pam sink 7 preo pam archbiscope 7 dina lag swa hit erstud 7 gif hein mon par affili likey agild. If anyone commits hamscon, let him make bot for it with £5 to the king by English law, and in Kent from hamscon 5 to the king and 3 to the archbishop, and by Danish law as it formerly stood, if he there be killed, let him lie unpaid for. It is not very clear what the hamscon was. In the Latin versions, it is translated by invasio domi, and it seems to be the same thing as the heimskon of Norse laws. It seemed to be a breach of the peace within the sacred precinct of the heim, and the penalty seems to place it on the same ground as the borbreis and munbird of the king, so as to have become in Newt's time one of the crimes in which Kent also involved a penalty of 50 Kentish skillings. Here then, the inference again is that 50 Kentish skillings were equal in Newt's time to £5 of silver. It is quite true that these two statements of Kentish law are not found in the other manuscripts of Newt's laws, so that in one sense they may be regarded as interpolations, but in the MSG they are not insertions made afterwards. In both passages, the words form an integral part of the text, which throughout is written in a clear and excellent hand. It is difficult to suggest any reason for the insertion of these two statements of Kentish law other than the deliberate intention to point out that the amount of the Kentish king's mundbird of 50 Kentish skillings was the same as the Wessex mundbird of £5 of silver. In addition, therefore, to the fact that at a ratio of 1 to 12 between gold and silver the two amounts were alike, these passages seem to show that the penalty of 50 Kentish skillings had been permanently recognized in Newt's time as equal to the English penalty of £5 of silver. If the comparison had been made throughout in silver scates, the equation would not have held good so exactly, for 1,000 scates would not have equaled exactly £5, i.e. 1,200 of the same scates. The exact equation seems to have been between 50 Kentish gold skillings of 2 tremises and £5 of silver at the current Frankish ratio of 1 to 12. So that the direct evidence of these passages from Newt's laws goes very far to verify the hypothesis derived from numismatic considerations that the skilling of the Kentish laws was a gold skilling of 2 tremises, like that of the continental Saxons and northeast Frisians. It is, however, only fair to say that Schmid, while adhering to the view that the Kentish skilling was of 20 scates, has suggested that these scates may have been not silver tremises or pence, but farthings, so that the Kentish skilling of 20 farthings might be identical with the Wessex skillings of 5d. Conrad von Maurer held the same view. But if this could be supposed for a moment, the Kentish scate would then be only 1/4 of the scate of the fragment of Mercian law, and the mundbird of King Ethelbert would be only 1/4 of that of the Wessex king, notwithstanding the assertion in MSG of the laws of Newt that the Kentish mundbird was £5 of silver, like those of other English laws. With all deference, therefore, to the view of these great authorities, a careful examination of the evidence seems to lead to the conclusion that it cannot be maintained. Nor does there appear to be any reason why the Kentish skilling should be expected to be the same as the Wessex skilling, as we know that the Wessex skilling of 5d differed from the Mercian skilling of 4d. We adhere then to the view that the Kentish skilling was a skilling of 2 gold tremises, like the Saxon solidus, and that it was equated with the or Roman ounce of silver, i.e. 20 scates. The reader will be able to form his own judgment as to whether examination of the various clauses of the Kentish laws and the amount of the varigolds and other payments now to be considered will confirm this conclusion or not. I think it will be found substantially to do so. End of section 32.